Good morning, Nathan.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm going to try to share this screen.
Looks good from this end.
Okay, I think we're recording, so I'm going to restrict screen sharing and where participants cannot unmute themselves. And
Okay.
we'll get started at 9 o'clock. Thank you, Dr. Fox.
All righty, thank you.
Dr. Fox, you're unmuted and everything should be ready to go. So you just let me know when you want me to start sharing the screen.
Okay, let's go ahead. I have that it's 9 a.m., so I want to be aware of everybody's time this morning. So if you will go ahead and share the screen, we will get started. Good morning, everyone. We are delighted that you are joining us this morning as we look at our second series, our second session in our series around our educational alignment to the workforce needs, and particularly in light of COVID-19. And so today we'll be talking about fostering a multicultural retention climate to retain employees. We'll go through the PowerPoint presentation and hopefully have some time at the end for some discussions. So again, on behalf of the Land of Sky Collaborative, we are just delighted to have you. So as we begin, we'll look at our learning objectives for today. And so what we're looking at, we want to have some conversations around creating a climate of employee inclusion, and particularly as we look beyond COVID-19 and start bringing back folks, bringing back the high performing individuals, but also tapping into some markets that we may not have tapped in before. You will get a copy of today's presentation, so don't worry about trying to jot down everything. We'll talk about decoding cultural biases that may be occurring in the workplace that may be hampering your ability to retain certain populations of workers. Understanding implicit biases, eliminating those system biases as much as possible in position descriptions, and then we'll end with some strategies around measuring inclusion. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So our work this morning is part of the My Future NC goal. The My Future NC organization out of Raleigh grew out of the governor's commissions around educational attainment. And so the Land of Sky region, the 4 counties of Buncombe, Henderson, Transylvania, and Madison, is a pilot program around the attainment goal. And so my future goal out of North Carolina is to increase the total number of 25 to 44-year-old North Carolinians with a post-secondary credential or degree by 2 million by the year 2030. Now, it's predicted if we don't do anything around preparing folks to be employees, that there will be a statewide shortfall of 400,000 potential employees. The Land of Sky region, it's been predicted, again, if we don't do anything around our current hiring, that it will be a shortfall of 10,000. Now, again, this is pre-COVID-19 numbers. So we're going to start today around talking about the layers of culture and inclusion, because one of the things we want to do, particularly as we hopefully move out of COVID-19 to more openings, is we want to make sure we are retaining our best employees, our high-performing employees, while at the same time recruiting those folks to our area that we have a gap in terms of skills, abilities, and competencies needed. So when we start looking at culture and defining culture, it's the shared values, the shared beliefs that folks have, the shared practices that folks have within our organizations. And often they're unspoken. It's just the way things are done within the organizations. As we go to the next slide, we'll see that there are various levels that we need to be aware of in the organizations as we're working with our workforce. So at the individual level, We have individuals that have their own culture or subcultures. We know in the US, we are a population of subcultures. And so that makes it even more difficult in trying to measure the environmental climate within our organization, because each individual is bringing their various components of culture with them. We also have the demographics and the physical compositions of our local region. And so one of the issues we have in recruitment and retaining of diverse populations, that is when we're looking at our demographics, we have limited diversity within our population. So we have limited amounts to draw from our labor market. So we have to be creative with inclusion strategies, where we start growing our own talent, our human talents, by creating partnerships in the communities. That individual levels also includes the emotions that individuals bring with them. It includes the perceptions that those individuals bring with them, and also stereotyping. Those perceptions leads to our attitudes, the shaping of our attitudes and our behaviors within the workplace. Our group level then is made up of those individual employees that are part of our organizations that become our co-workers. And we see sometimes within our organization, organizational cliques that forms. We see organizational policies and politics that occur. And so those co-workers bring those individuals cultural things with them that then forms what we call in-groups and out-groups. The in-groups within the co-workers tend to be folks in our organization that are very similar. They tend to have the same or similar background, similar education. We tend to look like each other. And so we form those organizational cliques of the in-groups, where folks may feel like they're part of the out-group and not part of an inclusive work environment. That leads to our group structure also around the group level of culture, where it has an impact on committee works and who we put on teams. And so we tend to, again, not only look at folks that we know will get the work done, but we tend to pull on that in group where we know that there won't be a lot of conflict, because those folks are similar to us in their attitudes, in their beliefs, in their personality. That also then has an impact on who we're tapping in terms of group leadership. And so when you look at your organizations and you start looking at who's having that upward mobility in your organizations around leadership, you have to ask yourself, are there in-group theories occurring, or are our national leaders just rising up? And if we find that there's some in-group things going on, what strategies can we increase within our organizations to be more inclusive at every level of management and leadership? That group level also then has an impact around group power. Who has power within that organization, who has influence in that organization, and your organizational politics or office politics that occurs. When we start looking at the individual and the group level of culture and their variables, that then shapes the organizational level. And so that organizational level is made up of things like the cultural narrative within the organization. And so when you think about your organization, you have to ask yourself, what traditionally has or historically been the narrative about our company? Particularly if you ask your inside employees, what do you think about the company or our organization? What's the history of the organization? What do people think about us? And then have that same conversation with folks externally in your community. So how does the community view our organization? Do they view us as an inclusive environment where folks have seen by our demonstrating policies that folks can have upward mobility within the organization? Or do they see us as a closed system organization where we tap our internal leaders. It may be seen as the good old boy syndrome within our organization. What's the environment within the organization? So to give you kind of an example of that, in a previous job, I worked for NC Real, which is Rural Entrepreneurship Through Action Learning. We were in all 100 counties in some aspect of North Carolina. And as we travel, as the staff traveled from one county to another, it was always interesting, whichever organization we were working with, to hear what the local folks thought about that organization. So if we were going into an industry to talk with displaced workers, if we were going into a educational institution, a college, a university, to hear the local folks say, well, really, we don't apply there because they just don't hire us. Or they look down on immigrants, or you have to speak English and speak English well to be hired there. And then to ask the employers in the leadership team in that company, how does the community view you? There was often a gap in the narrative, the cultural narrative of that organization. So we have to be aware of those. At the organizational level is where we also start looking at support. So how are we supporting inclusion, recruitment, retention within our organizations? When I do an audit, I follow the money. I look at where are we putting our money around our budget. So are we, particularly in our training budgets, are we putting money towards recruitment and retention of diverse population to be more inclusive? Or are we spending most of our training dollars in other aspects? What's the percentage of our training budget around, or our overall budget around training and development compared to other aspects? So when we start looking at that piece of pie, we start really understanding the support level in which we are looking at. The other aspect of looking at how inclusive we are is, as we're losing employees, are we asking them, why are you separating from our organization? And what can we do to retain you? I've only had one experience in my adult life where I had left an organization, and several years later, the organization reached back out to me. They were doing some additional hiring. They were going through employees' files that had separated from the organization, and they were really trying to be more inclusive and bring back folks that they valued. And I get a call from a previous supervisor that said, we know that you left our organization several years ago. We are hiring, we have an open position, but before we started looking externally per se, we wanted to go back through our files to see who we had lost that we value, that we might be able to reach back out to. Would you consider reemployment with us? That's the only time in my adult life that has happened. And so again, as we think about our recruitment strategies and our retention strategies and being more inclusive, we have to be intentional around not only retaining those high performance employees, but also looking at who separated, why they separated, and is there a possibility to have them return? And so that then becomes part of our practices and our procedures within our organizations. Now, one of the things I encourage organizations to think about is go and do an inclusive equity audit around your practices and procedures. And so in most cases, we have inherited our practices and our procedures. These are the ways things have always been done. And we forget to take that equity lens to look at those. The equity lens means that as we're going through each of our practices, each of our procedures, we are saying, how does this impact our clients? How does this impact, and really we start internally with our internal customer satisfaction? How does this impact our current employees? How does this impact employees that are a different gender than myself? How does this impact people of a darker hue? How does this impact, and then the list goes on and on and on, but being very intentional up front to say, okay, we can't continue to do business the way we've always done it. And to ask those difficult questions around procedures. Well, why is this procedure in place? How long have we had this procedure? Who does this possibly exclude in our intent around that? So as we go to the next slide, we start looking at our layers around what is visible to us, our visible clues. So we started looking at our organizational website. If I'm a potential employee looking at your website as a possible job opportunity, how inclusive is that website? Do I see folks that of a diverse population on your website? Do I see a mission statement that has some type of diversity inclusive statement in it? Do I see company values, organizational values that say to me as an employee, this is a place I want to work at? So looking at our website and taking an equity audit to say, okay, how do people see our work, our website when they look at it? What does the organizational social media say? So a lot of times, we think about how we prepare in an organization to interview and onboard folks during our recruitment and selection process, but our high performance employees are doing exactly the same thing. They are looking at your organization to say, is this an organization that I want to work for? And particularly the higher levels that you go up, because you're trying to recruit somebody that's professional, that in most cases already have a good job, and in most cases already has a good salary. So what are you doing to make yourself more marketable when folks look at your website, when they look at your social media? And then the visual clues also are your exhibited policies, procedures, rules, and regulations. So, as an auditor around equity and diversity and inclusion, I'm looking at how many policies, procedures do you have? How consistent are they? Do they, on their face value, look like they are equitable to all employees? But then as part of that audit, I'm also asking employees in surveys and focal groups, well, how consistently are your managers, supervisors, et cetera, following your policies, procedures, rules, and regulations? Is your perception that is fair and equitable to everybody? And so not just making sure that you have these policies in place, but doing an annual review of these to say, okay, if I was female, if I was male, if I was an employee of a darker hue, if I was non-majority population, what would this policy say to me, and how relevant is it? What's the signs that you have in your parking lots? As folks first drive up into your organization on your parking lots, how invitational, inviting are they? Where do you have your handicap parking? Do top management have a parking space? All of that kind of tells us or gives us visual clues around what's important to that organization. To give you an example, when I was still in the South Carolina educational system, I became a Zinger Miller facilitator, which is now, I think, Global Achieve or Achieve Global. And one of our clients was BMW, as they were looking to move into the Greenville area. And so we did training for all of their managers, their associates, down to even the folks that were cutting the grass. And one of the visual clues that really spoke to who they were in terms of their organizational climate was once they built the plant, and their training center, um, when you drove up to the training center, there were video cameras, uh, very visible within the parking lot. We used to joke that you couldn't sneeze without them seeing what you were doing. And it created an organizational climate that said, particularly in the early days, that there was some distrust from management that they had to videotape everything with the employees. You had a electronic key card that let you in and out of the building, that recorded you as you came in, how long you were there, when you exited the building. Um, you know, that was a good thing in some cases around security. As a trainer, I was training on the second shift. So at night, we had a particular client or employee there that had really some behavior that was not normal that evening. And because all of the rooms were recorded, et cetera, security was in the room within 3 or 4 minutes of some statements that I made. Now, what that said to the folks, the employees that were in the training, it said, okay, everything that we're doing is recorded. The only places that they were told that the cameras were not in was the dressing rooms and the restrooms. So think about the climate that created. Um, Building signs, displays within your building, the artwork that's on your building, on your walls. Is it very inclusive or is it exclusive? Did you even intentionally think about it? What's on our bulletin boards? And then what's the language that we use within our organization, within our offices, within our meetings, our staff meetings, and even now more so on our Zoom calls. So what's the banter that's occurring? Who is it directed towards? Who seems to be doing it? All that shapes the organizational culture. And then the stories that are shared within the company. Who's the heroes that everybody talks about? What's the furniture and type and placement? And then what's the actual attire that folks have in terms of the accepted norm? So those are the visual clues that we have. The next slide shows some invisible clues. So as we're trying to measure the organizational climate and how inclusive we are, what are the unspoken policies? And so those are the things like, well, the policy says that for procurement, we have to do this, this, and this. But really, if you want this expedited, what you need to do is this. Now that shows you who is the influential leaders, the official leaders in the organizations, and who's the folks that know how to get around all the policies. What's the unspoken procedures? What's the unspoken rules, regulations? What's the hidden assumptions in the organizations? And how do you get to those? So as you're observing the workforce and you're trying to get to those hidden assumptions, think about the various groups that make up your employment base. And does it seem like certain population have some stereotyping around certain folks that lead to their hidden beliefs? So as we go to the next slide, what we want to start looking at is we want to start viewing our various populations through the eyes of the different groups that make up our workforce. So what does our visual or visible symbols say to people that are a different gender? What does our visible symbol say to folks that are in different age groups? What does our symbols say to the differently abled individuals? What does our symbols say around different race and ethnicities? What does our symbol say to people that are from a different social and economic group, or from different veteran groups, or different sexual identity or sexual orientation from us? So what does it really say? And again, as we're trying to be more inclusive, we have to be very intentional and strategic. I know that I have probably driven folks that I have worked with just crazy in some cases because of the type of work that I do. I'm always saying, well, okay, when we make this policy change, how is this going to impact this group? How is this going to impact X group? For example, I was working with an organization where to apply for a position there, we moved to almost 100% online application. So you uploaded your application, you uploaded your resume, you uploaded your references, and most organizations have gone to that piece of technology. But as we were trying to be more inclusive, one of the things I said was, okay, one of the things you told me is you're really reaching out to the reentry population. You're really reaching out to folks for reskilling in your organization. And so just because you have shifted to 100% online onboarding, then what does that do to a potential employee that may be in a women's battered shelter that may have limited access to the computer? What might this do to a veteran that may be, and was an organization here in the Asheville area? So what might that do to a potential employee that's a veteran that's living at the veteran quarters where they may have limited access to the internet and computers? What might this do to low wealth communities where they may be in public housing, or they may be in an area where there's not broadband or reliable internet? What might this do to someone that may be in a wealthy community, but it's isolated and it's remote? And so the story that I shared with them was teaching an online course, a student living in the Biltmore Forest area, but up in the hills where she didn't have broadband. And so in terms of just online courses, she couldn't get online to do those things. And so when we're thinking about the various groups that we're reaching out to as potential employees, a simple change in our policy may have an impact on equity in terms of access to resources, access to information. And so we have to think about that. So how do your symbols impact your ability to recruit and retain individuals as you're looking at that? So our next slide is a visual around cultural norms. And so when we're trying to think about our cultural norms are being derived from several areas that we have to think about. And we need to be more intentional around thinking around ecosystems. When we think about ecosystems or systems in general, those are the things that make up who we are as an organization. And so there are some regional and local demographic things that we take into consideration as an organization trying to hire. And again, let's just say we can use this for any topic that we were discussing. This morning, we're really tying it directly with our recruitment strategies and our retention strategies. And so we have to look at our region and our local demographics that shape our regional and local norms when we're hiring. So as a male of a Dr. Hugh, there are certain counties in North Carolina, particularly when I was working with NC Real and having to travel in all 100 counties, there were certain counties that I just felt uncomfortable in as a male of a Dr. Hugh. And part of that was, I remember driving into Graham County, and there was, as you came across the county line, there was this huge billboard that said, welcome to the original cracker. And I thought, oh, I hope that means that they're talking about the graham cracker. But as a male of a Dr. Hugh, I'm thinking, what is that really saying? Does it have cultural significance for this region? And then I had a flashback, high school days growing up in Tryon, and our basketball teams and our football teams playing in some of our remote counties, and some of the signs that were up in their gyms. Things like don't be caught here after dark. Or after a basketball or football game, local folks surrounding the bus and rocking it back and forth, or throwing rocks at it. So all of that regional norms, and not to pick on Graham County, but that memory just stuck with me as a potential person working in that county. And it had an impact on the work that I did in that county. So I always filled my gas tank up before I went into that county. I always made sure if I was going to a particular plant or a particular college there, I went straight there, did my presentation around entrepreneurship and our curriculum, and I was out of there before dark. And so again, if we have privilege, and that's not our norm, or our frame of reference in those counties, then we may not be aware of the impact that it may have on our hiring. We were hiring we were hiring an employee in this area that drove up from the Hickory area. And this was only a couple of years ago. And actually, this flag is still there. And this was a female person of a Dr. Hugh. And during the interview, we like folks to feel comfortable. And we said, "Oh, how was your drive up here?" And she said, "It was a little unnerving." And I thought, "Oh, okay, well, traffic must have been bad." And she said, "No, I got near Hickory, and there were two locations where there was a huge battle flag flying." She said it was so huge I could see it from the interstate. And she said, "I really had to question, did I want to actually move into this area?" And so just being aware of those regional demographics, those regional local norms, and how they impact the cultural norms within a local institutions. And so who is the predominant voice in those local institutions? Who do they look like? Is it male dominated? Is it female dominated? And so notice that the wording that I'm using, because it shapes culture. So as a male of a darker hue, a lot of times I'll get folks that will ask me in this work, how do you identify? Do you like to be called African American, Black, person of color? And my answer to that is, first of all, I think that's good that you feel comfortable asking me that. I identify as Joseph. My friends know me as Fox. And I said, really, unless we're having a discussion around federal regulations, I'm not seeing the relevance of even having that conversation. I said, because technically, if you're a person of a darker hue, you may not be African American. My DNA history says that my family roots are out of Spain. So technically, we would be European American. I have friends from the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, etc., and they have said to me, the people that are darker hue in the United States are the only folks that I know that refer to themselves as African Americans when they're not from Africa, or all of them are not descendants of Africa. I was doing some work with another group, and someone said, "Well, we use person of color." And one of the females that was a darker hue raised her hand, and she said, "Well, I find that offensive." And they said, "Well, we're trying to be sensitive. Why would you find that offensive?" She said, "Because as a female of a darker hue," and actually, I think she said as a Black female, she said, I'm older. I'm about to turn 65. And she said, I'm from that generation where the term colored was used when we were growing up. So when I hear person of color, it pulls me back to that time period where as a kid, I could not go to certain areas. I couldn't do certain things. I have other friends that says, well, black is a color. And if I take a black crayon and hold it up, my skin tone is not that color. So one of the things I tend to say is a person of darker hue. Now, in terms of your organizational culture, you have to find what is the right norms, what's the right terminology, what makes people feel inclusive within your organization. Even and you have to question with yourself around, is it important to put labels on folks? So I do a lot of work around entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship development, um, and work with micro lenders. And we're bad about wanting folks to classify themselves as a minority-owned business. And we are bad around having policies around being, and the intent is to be good and to be inclusive, around inclusive, diverse vendors. But do we say, who's your list of majority vendors? Who's your list of majority business owners? And the same thing happens in communities where we'll say, who are the African American community leaders? But we don't say, who are the white leaders in those communities? So just being aware of those conscious cultural biases or unconscious, because we've been taught that from an implicit system. So all of that shapes our beliefs, our attitudes, and our practices within our organizations. Now, I get pushback sometimes around this piece where folks might say, well, does it really matter? It does matter in that we're trying to be more culturally sensitive and culturally aware of the things and our practices that we're doing within our organization, particularly if we're trying to retain folks. Now, the other piece of that is to recognize in our cultural norm ecosystem that there are some variables that we may not be able to change. We may not have a major impact on our local demographics. We may not have a major impact on our local and regional norms. But what we do have an impact on is being very strategic and intentional around the strategies that we implement. And so several years ago, I worked with the Diversity Engagement Coalition of Western North Carolina, which is an organization made up of member companies, employers, that are intentionally and strategically trying to be more inclusive around their hiring practices, but also their retention practices. And one of the comments that we looked at was, even when you're able to recruit diverse populations into Western North Carolina, how do you retain them? Particularly if that person doesn't feel like there's a cultural environment that speaks to their culture in your local downtown, in your regional area. And so one of the strategies that the Diversity Engagement Coalition did, and again, I haven't worked with them in several years, but I was their lead coordinator for about 2.5 years. But at that time, one of their strategies was within their member organizations, their employers, they said, okay, let's share resumes with each other. So when we hire somebody and they have a partner or a spouse that is coming to this area, if we can employ that person, then let's be very intentional of passing that resume around to our member organizations that might have a position for that spouse, for that partner, for their family members if they have adult children that's moving with them. Because overall, we will probably be in a better light of retaining that person if their spouse, if their partner, if their significant other can also find a job in our area. And then the other piece of that was they said, but when they move here, they say there's nothing for them to do that fits their culture. So within our organization, let's start sharing our calendars of events, and let's be very strategic around activities that we're having. So if we're MAHAC, which was one of their partners, when we do our when we do our MLK programming, when we do our Juneteenth programming, when we do our Black History programming, and they were focused very much on males of darker hues in terms of employment gaps in Western North Carolina. They said, let's share these activities around our member organizations and invite all of our employees from all of these organizations to be a part of the celebration. If it's UNC Asheville Center for Diversity, which was one of their partners, one of their founding partners, actually, as you all have diverse activities, Women Month, International Day, et cetera, let's share a common schedule, calendar events so that folks, as we are recruiting them to this area, realize that there are some activities that are occurring that fits their organization. And then the last part of that cultural norm ecosystem is looking at families' beliefs, values, and traditions and how they impact our workforce. So again, we have quite a few people on the training this morning. So I hope I'm not stepping on anybody's feet from Haywood County. But when I worked in Haywood County with students trying to help them be employable, I said to several students, I have contacts in Asheville-Buncombe County that's looking for an accountant, looking for whatever that position was. Would you like me to make an introductory contact and would you be willing to apply there? It's only a 30, 40-minute drive from where you live. I had a number of students that said, oh no, we can't drive to Buncombe County for a job. And I said, well, what if it pays twice the amount that you're making here in Haywood County? Would you not consider that? So part of our ecosystem even have that impact on family traditions and maybe not even leaving the county. As we look at the next slide, so what we're really talking about is we're really trying to enhance our cultural competencies when we think about all of these variables that not only make up our local area that we are pulling from for our labor pool, but also our organizational culture. So we define cultural competencies as the capacity to interact effectively with other culture. Now, part of that is first to have a self assessment of who you are and your culture, or what you describe as your culture or your cultural norms. What are the things that you embrace that may have an impact on how you deal with other folks, and also how you interact with folks? So even when we talk about just that family component, I tell folks, I have two sisters, and they could not be any different in terms of my interaction with them. And part of that is to understand myself. So I know that I tend to be a very matter-of-fact person. I mean, my background is business, my degrees are in business. So I tend to be very factual oriented. I tend to be very opinionated. I tend to be assertive, not aggressive in terms of cultural values. But I tend to state my point of view. And the other piece of that is I realize the older I get, the less patient I am around folks that beat around the bush to get to their point. Now, in realizing that, though, I have to realize how I interact with my two sisters. My older sister is a retired major out of the Air Force. She is a nurse, but went back and got an MBA because of supervisory duties that she had, not only in the Air Force, but in private work at hospitals. But she is very much like me. So the in group. She is very matter of fact. She is very much by the book. When we have a conversation, it usually doesn't last longer than 5 minutes. Hey, I'm calling to give you an update on dad. This is what I need. Talk to you later. My younger sister, who is a supervisor in social work, is very emotional, wear her heart on her sleeve. I do not pick up the phone to talk with her if she's calling if I don't have 45 minutes to an hour to talk to her, because she is going to have to tell me about what all the kids are doing, what's going on her job, what's going on in the community, what's going on in her church before. Oh, and by the way, I called to ask you, that's going to be at the very end of our conversation. And so I know that if it sounds like I'm typing or doing something else in the background and not giving her my full attention, she's going to be offended. And so as we think about how we even start those conversations with folks in our organizations, we first must realize who we are, how we communicate with folks, how we come across to folks, and then bridge that gap. So another example of that, I have an individual that I work with in some voluntary work, and I'm not quite sure what's going on. But if I say that it's day, she is going to say it's night. If I say it's raining outside, she is going to say the sun is shining. And so I've had to find workarounds where we have to work together on several projects. So I've gone to an ally and I've said, okay, why don't you suggest that we do this, this, and this? Because if it comes from me, she's going to immediately say, we're not going to do that. So that awareness, the capacity to draw upon cultural knowledge. So now that has the implication that we got to get to know other folks' culture. And we have to be able to ask folks about their culture without um, offending them, having that awareness. Right now we can Google anything. And so when you see a particular hairstyle, if you see a particular piece of attire, go to the internet and look it up. But having some sensitivity and then practices within our organizations. Cultural competency also looks at the values, the norms, and traditions that lead to perceptions of other groups. So what are the perceptions that we have around with folks? And so I know that my family and friends sometimes just get tired of me saying, that's a microaggression. Somebody will say something and I'll say, that's a microaggression. You are stereotyping around a specific group or a specific age group or a specific practice. And so just making ourselves aware of that, particularly in our organization, and how it may impact our ability to retain folks within our organization. In saying that, also realize that everything that you're doing in your organization is being viewed by folks that look differently than you, and trying to perceive your actions. They're trying to perceive, are they being biased? Are they being insensitive? Are they being unaware? Are they using microaggressions, or are they just rude and don't realize how rude that sounds? So understanding that culture. So what are some things we can do? So as we move to this next slide, we're moving into, once we have that awareness, then how do we start fostering an inclusive work environment? So one of the things is increasing your source of non-majority recruiting. Notice again, I like to use the word majority and non-majority because it will change. And so one of the things I caution you around being more inclusive, when folks hear inclusion, equity, diversity, usually the first place they go in their mind, going back to cultural perception, is around race and ethnicity. I like to say majority and non-majority because it will vary by the industry. So for example, I did a couple weekends ago, I guess it's now been some inclusion work through Lenore Ryan with their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Institute. And one of the ladies that was on the call, she said, I work in early childhood education. So the majority population in my office is females. And so one of the issues we have is how do we recruit males into a female dominated industry? And so again, getting away from that mindset that when we talk about inclusion, you go straight to race and ethnicity, to thinking really more broadly around majority and non-majority population. But starting with checking your recruitment process for system biases. So where do you recruit? How do you recruit? What papers are you using? If you're using traditional sources of recruitment, where are you spending your recruitment budget on non-traditional sources of recruitment, but really looking at that. And then saying, are we putting some barriers up in our recruitment process? So what does our recruitment process look like? I've encouraged some of my personal clients to actually flow chart it, to say, okay, who initiates a position that needs to be filled? What's the process for that initiation? What's the process for reviewing the current position description? Who reviews it? How do they review it? Do they use an equity lens? Are there some things that your company has done to build in some questions around the qualifications that we're setting as minimum qualifications, the qualifications that we're setting around preferred qualifications in that position description? Then who does it go to? Does it go to HR for their review? Are they only reviewing it for HR compliance, the legal ease that needs to be there? Or are they also been trained to review it with an equity lens? Do they know that what that means? And then from that piece, where does it go? So as we're onboarding or bringing folks in for doing our recruitment process, and let me back up also, because this came up with a private client that I had recently around their recruitment process. They said, as we're hiring folks, it seems like the community only feels like we're hiring folks in housekeeping and groundskeeping. And we hire folks in all other areas: accounting, finance, bookkeeping, IT, marketing, etc. We may not have as many positions open in that. And I said, okay, but what is your recruitment message saying? When you are sending out recruitment information, what's on your banner? Well, we have our name of our company, we have our logo. I said, well, if you're trying to break through some historical cultural norms of who you have traditionally hired, and particularly if you're looking at your hiring staff and processes, and traditionally you've had folks that English was not their first language, that you hired only in housekeeping, then maybe on your banner that you're displaying in job fairs, you need to list some of these areas that you're hiring for, so that you're breaking that cultural perception that you only hire in housekeeping and groundskeeping. So again, being very strategic and intentional, even in the recruitment method in which you are hiring for, or you're using, the wording that you're using. And then have you trained hiring managers and search committee members related to inclusive hiring practices? There are several good articles out there, and I didn't include them here. The one that I use a lot of times is one dealing with academia, that talks about top-down approach, that sometimes at the top organizational managers are very in tune with inclusion and equitable treatment. However, they have failed to train the folks at the lower level that are actually conducting the interview around system biases. So being very conscious around that. Creating an incentive referral system. Some of your best recruitment of non-majority folks will come from folks that are in those communities, in those populations. So I was looking at who's on the list today, and I know quite a few of you. So most of you know that I had been a department chair of AV Tech for 7 years before taking early retirement after 24 years with the North Carolina Community College System. But one of the first things that I did um, as a new department chair of a Dr. Hugh was I reached out to all of my friends and folks that had been coworkers to say, hey, yeah, I have this new position. I'm hiring X number of adjuncts this term. Who you know that has a master's and 18 hours in business to teach college transfer business courses? Who do you know fits their qualification for accounting, human resources management, et cetera? But I use that network that I had. So if you think about how you can tap into the networks that you have, that will bring in referrals. And then if it's being internal by employees, think of what you can build in. It may be just a $25 gift card for every 3 people that somebody refers to that are a new hire within your organization. For everything that you're doing, not just around your inclusive work, but really recruiting high performing employees. So again, being more intentional. Now, the other thing to do is think about your clients. So when I was at AV Tech, my clients base was students. So as a new department chair of a Dr. Hugh, I made it my goal to get up 3 or 4 times during the day from my desk to just walk around campus to be visible for our non-majority students so that they made that connection and felt comfortable and included on campus. So again, just the little things that we can do. Connect with local diverse colleges and universities and the student groups that are on those campuses. So if you're trying to recruit folks or you're trying to create a pipeline, because we said we're not that diverse when you look at our local demographics. So UNC Asheville, AV Tech, Blue Ridge Community College, and on, they have a lot of student groups on their campuses, student organizations, student clubs. They have multicultural organizations. So reach out to those folks doing job fairs to say, okay, these are the qualifications we're looking for. And as you're completing your degree, we want to stay in touch with you. But again, a lot of times what we'll do is we will reach out to the HR department in those organizations who may not be aware of those students in the student groups. As a department chair, folks started circumventing companies, local companies, that were on my advisory committees would circumvent calling HR. They would call me directly to say, hey, we need a bookkeeper. Who's graduating in your 2-year accounting program that you would recommend? Now, a lot of times, because I didn't teach the accounting courses, I taught the entrepreneurship classes or human resources management courses. I would say, let me call my lead accounting instructor and see who she recommends. But making those intentional connections with those folks that know those potential high performing employees at local colleges and universities. And then connecting with local diverse community organizations, getting out of our comfort zones to get into the communities that we're targeting. If we're targeting re-entry folks, who do we know that's working with re-entry folks in our community? Who's working with skill up programs? Who can we have Philip Cooper on the call today, who's excellent to reach out to around skill development and the reentry population. So are we making those connections with folks in the community around being more inclusive in our hiring practices? Are we reaching out to Mountain Express and Urban News, Mrs. Johnny Grant, who's female of Dr. Hugh that owns the Urban newspaper. So again, where are we advertising? Are we reaching out to the Hispanic Latino magazines and radio stations, et cetera, is we're hiring? Examine whether or not communities see you as a majority dominant institute. Now, I've had several companies that I've worked for in the 30 years of my educational history. And as I've gone out into local communities, I remember recruiting in Statesville, North Carolina. Um, as I was working in Statesville, I went out to one of the local churches that was, I'm a CME, Christian Methodist Episcopal. And so I went to the local CME church there. And I said, hey, I'm a new hire here at the local community college. Would love for folks to apply to teach business courses. One of the people told me, they said, we don't apply over there. They don't hire. We're surprised they hired you. And so again, be very intentional in how the community see us, whether or not they see us as a majority dominant institute where they don't feel inclusive. And I said, well, they hired me, so they must be trying to change their image. Now, the thing I didn't know at that time, and this was back early 80s, was they had just had a big thing in the newspaper where the few non-majority and staff and faculty that they had actually filed an EEO complaint against them around some of their hiring practices, et cetera. Which also created a very hostile environment. When I was hired, I actually had a counterpart white male walk up to me and said, they only hired you because of your skin color. We've had some racial issues on campus, and I said, well, I wish I had known that before I got degrees, because I would have just applied as a male of a darker hue. So what we're trying to do is foster a multicultural retention climate within our organizations. So as we go to the next slide, let's think about and reflect on some of the things that we are talking about. So Nathan, if you can advance us to the next slide, please. So as we're waiting for him to get with us, he may have gotten a phone call. When we start thinking about what we're talking about this morning, just understand that culture is like an onion. The more you peel that onion, the more changes you see. And so when you start peeling that onion in terms of trying to understand and be more inclusive within our organizations, we have some geographic and regional and local norms that we have to think about. And so, a lot of times I will tell folks, just think about it from agenda based. How have we treated our female employees? Have we put up barriers for them? Have we made it easy for them to get into leadership roles? Do they see upward mobility within the organizations? Then how do we apply that to age differences, skin color differences, et cetera, et cetera? So the geographic region and local, peel back that layer of the onion, peel back the personal biases that we might have. I have been doing this kind of work for 30 something years. And so I like to think that I'm aware of most of my biases, but occasionally one will creep up that I wasn't aware of. I was reviewing some applications for a new hire, and there was somebody that had listed that they were a retired, I think, colonel or general from the military, and my radar immediately went up to say, oh gosh, this person is going to be very much by the book, by the rules, and not be flexible in dealing with our client base. And then I had to immediately say, wait a minute, that's a cultural bias I have, or a personal bias around military folks. And so does this person meet minimum requirement? Yes. Does this person meet preferred job requirement? Yes. Are these minimum and preferred job requirements relevant to the task that they're going to be doing in this job? Yes. then we're going to move this person's name through for an interview. And so just being aware of it, and then and catching yourself on that personal level of that onion, and then looking at the organizational level. So what is the organizational norms? And then start thinking about what is the current state of affairs within our organization. So when we're just looking at numbers and categories of employees, what does that look like? And then inclusion is really getting away from that mindset that takes us straight to just race and gender, or race and ethnicity, but to say we're trying to attract the best candidate. We are trying to retain the best employees. We're trying to include diverse and unique practices. We're trying to reflect and align with our cultural base that we're working with. Nathan, are you back with us? So as we are more conscious around that, reflect more around the impact that it has on the managerial decisions. So again, it's with, and one of the things I probably should point out is this is part 2. One more slide, please. This is part 2. Thank you. This is part 2 of our series. So let me just back up to say there is a difference, and we talked about this in the first presentation, around diversity, inclusion, and equity. So as you're looking at your managerial decisions and you're looking at recruitment, et cetera, think about what those terms mean. Diversity just means differences. So we're checking the box around the various categories around age, around ethnicity, around race, around social economics, around social identity or sexual identity or sexual orientation, or whatever those categories are that make folks different categories. That's just diversity. We are not being inclusive. So inclusion means that folks are having a voice in the decision making. They're at the table. They are intentionally part of the conversations that we're having in the organization. So diversity, checking the box, differences, diversity only equals differences. Inclusion, meaning we're being strategic and intentional in giving people a voice in our organization, making them visible in the organization, letting them participate in the organization. Equity means we're going a step further to make sure everyone, and particularly our non-majority employees, have access to everything they need to be successful in our organization. So access to information and to communication, to budgets, to whatever it is in your organizations that you need to be successful, is then applying that equity lens and asking yourself from an equity lens, does everybody have access to recruitment? Does everybody have access to the hiring process, and how transparent are we? Training, remote rewards, promotions, etc. So as we move on to the next slide, we start thinking about what are our biases that we may have in our organization. So when we talk about biases, we are in the most cases, implicit bias is unconscious. Now there may be some illicit or explicit biases that's occurring when folks are really using microaggressions and tending for those microaggressions to be intentional. And so, in the first series, we talked about what are microaggressions, and microaggressions being the overall umbrella. and that in most cases they're tied to implicit or unconscious attitudes, unconscious predispositions, etc. But Torres and some other researchers go on to say, but if they're conscious, if they're explicit, then you got folks in your work places that are intentionally being what we call micro insults. Micro insults are when our employees or folks in our local communities are intentionally attacking folks around their racial composition. Or a micro invalidation is when we are intentionally negating or minimizing somebody's experience. So if it's unconscious, it tends to be implicit bias. If it's conscious bias, explicit bias, it tends to be a micro invalidator or micro insult. So as we move on to the next slide, and we start trying to hear and decode cultural biases. So as we're looking and trying to decode cultural biases, if you're looking at your recruitment and onboarding process, you're hearing things like, he or she is not the right fit. Let's go back one slide, please. He or she is not just the right fit is what we may hear. Or we might hear folks say, we can't find qualified people. So when I hear that and I'm doing an audit, an inclusion equity audit, I'll say, well, what do you mean around we can't find qualified people? What are the criteria for the job? Or you might hear he or she wouldn't be a good team player. Or you may hear he or she was just hired because of his or her minority status, or he or she doesn't speak good English. And Nathan, I think you may be one or two slides ahead of me. When you're hearing those things, you're ahead of me. Go back the other way, previous slides. All right, right there. There we go. So when you're hearing these things, and one that I've heard more recently around inclusion and cultural training was a company that I was working with, and the HR person I had just finished the training. This was just last week. Had finished the training, and I usually will do a follow-up with the HR folks that have set up the training, a debriefing thing. And this was a part 3 of a training that I had just finished up, and we had just sent out a survey to their employees around the training and whether or not we were moving the needle and changing perceptions. And so one of the HR person, the director of HR, said, overall, the evaluations have been great for this training. And overall, we feel like we're going in the right direction. But I just want you to know that there was one comment that said they felt like you as a trainer had an attitude. And I just kind of chuckled and I said, did they say what my attitude was? I said, because everybody has an attitude. I said, I'm assuming they meant I had a negative attitude. And she said, no, they just said in their evaluation you had an attitude. And I said, well, really what that is you need to decode that. So what that means is because your company has embraced inclusion work from the top down, and their CEO was on the first training and actually addressed everybody. There were about 75 managers on the Zoom training. He addressed them and said, it is a top-down approach. We have put dollars behind our inclusion. This is where we're going. We have a 2-year commitment with Dr. Fox around not only doing a diversity inclusion audit for our company, but also the first year is training for our managers. The second year is training for our employees, etc. So because of that, I said, what you're hearing is decoding from that particular manager that when he said, or he or she, I don't know who it was, said that the trainer had an attitude. Basically, it was something in the training that they disagreed with, but didn't feel comfortable speaking up. So instead of really challenging the issue, when it's somebody that has a different perception of you, in decoding it, it's better to say that person has an attitude. I said, we hear that a lot with women and gender, that we will say that a male is being aggressive in the organization and in their upward mobility possibility, where we may say a female is being, and we may even use the B word in terms of that decoding. So the male, it's okay for that male to stick up for himself, but when a woman does it, we're saying, oh, she really doesn't fit our organization. So just be aware of that decoding. So as we go to that next slide, uncovering biases in the search and hiring process, we start looking at.
I apologize, Dr. Fox. I'm trying to change the slide and it's not responding, but hopefully it will.
Okay. We love technology, so when it works, it works. And when it doesn't, we are adaptable and we keep going. There we go. Oh. So it's where
Is this the correct slide?
That is, thank you.
Okay,
so
I apologize.
Not a problem. As we're uncovering biases in our search and hiring processes, and really you could apply this slide to anything that you're doing within your organization, but today our strategies is aligning what we're doing with employers and particularly their onboarding. And so, but you could take the slide and modify it for anything that your functional area in your organization. But the first thing is naming and understanding resistance, understanding where those resistant points are coming from so that you can come up with strategies to deal with them. So in this type of work, for example, I have several colleagues that do inclusion training. And I tell folks my personal values of this kind of training is I don't want white males, particularly older white males, sitting in one of my trainings to feel like I've taken a baseball bat and hit them over the head before they walk out. I want everybody to feel inclusive in the training. So when I'm talking about inclusion, usually I will start with gender and age differences and social economic differences, etc. And a lot of times race and ethnicity is the last variable that I talk about so that people don't shut down and folks don't feel like you are just blaming them for things that have occurred in the past. So understanding where that resistance may come from and developing strategies that works for you. Now, I have colleagues, as I say, that do this kind of training, they will start just with race. Or if you go to REI, the Racial Equity Institute training, they will tell you their training focus just on race. And so to be more inclusive in our hiring, we have to think about all of our areas. I know that I have a personal bias around communication styles of our younger population. And I give my niece and nephew a really hard time because all they want to do is text. And I'm like, if you need something, pick up the phone and call me. I'm about to turn 60. I text when I have to text, but that's not my preferred mode of communication. So particularly my nephew who recently texted me that wanted to borrow some money. I said, so if you want some money, you better call me because I'm not responding until we have a conversation around why you need it, why you didn't call my brother, your dad, and why are you calling me and when you can pay me back. We're not doing all that through text. So just knowing and understanding what our current, our biases are, what may have been tainted within our search committee biases. So looking at that and naming those, training not just HR guidance, the legal ease around that, but on inclusive hiring practices. And then truly understanding the differences around what affirmative action is and is not, and EEO programs, because sometimes that's where your resistance is coming from. Sometimes folks have just watched the news and the media, and it has not been, it amazes me how many folks still think affirmative action is a fairly mandated program. They don't realize it's a voluntary program to make up for past discrimination in employment in specific areas. And so just making sure that you're having those conversations with your search committees, teams, and your hiring managers. And then looking at the role of intercultural sensitivities. And so this model is moving from being defensive to being acceptance, to saying we're not going to be defensive when we hear the word diversity, inclusion, and equity, we are not going to minimize other folks' experiences, but we are going to be more acceptance or accepting in our hiring practices and within our organization. So as we go to the next slide, we look at the role of culture and racial identity.
Again, I apologize, Dr. Fox.
It's the rain. We're going to blame it on overcast and rain.
I think you need to blame it on the facilitator today, which would be me. But anyway, I will keep working at it.
Okay, so when we're uncovering and continue to uncover, we have to look at the role of culture and racial identity. So the friction that can occur between non-majority candidates and majority search committees. So again, as a potential employee of a Dr. Hugh, and I get a interview question sometimes, I'm sitting there before I answer it and I'm thinking, okay, what are they really asking me? And is it tied to me being a male of a Dr. Hugh, or are they asking this of everyone? So thank you. The role of cultural and racial identity, and have we trained our search committees around that? Or it could also be cultural. So if we have mainly men on the search committee, but we are interviewing some female candidates, what is that? Is there any cultural creations that are occurring there? So we moved to trying to have some goals for inclusion training. So we're looking, again, moving from defensive and minimizing people experience to acceptance and adaptation. We're looking at creating a multicultural consciousness around our organization. We're trying to increase our cultural competencies, and then we're addressing any cultural biases in our search and hiring process. But that means we got to ask ourselves those difficult questions around how does this impact women? How does this impact men? How does this impact veterans, et cetera? So as we move to the next slide, we start looking at trying to remove implicit biases from our position descriptions. So one strategy is to regularly review job analysis. Now, the HR person in me tells me that most companies don't do a thorough job analysis. So for our non-HR folks that's on the call, job analysis really should become the hub or the center of everything that we do. That a job analysis is we look at categories of jobs, We define those categories of jobs. We spell out all of the tasks required to do that job. And that's where our job positions, descriptions come from, to make sure they're non-biased, but they're based on the tasks that folks need to do. We also then start aligning our knowledge, skills, abilities, and other job characteristics to defining successful completion of those tasks. So again, we do some of this in organizations. We're not just intentional and strategic sometimes in an annual review of this. That leads us then to identifying our minimum job requirements and our preferred job qualifications. And those should be, again, tied to that job analysis. These are the specific tasks of the person will do in this job. And from that, these are our minimum job qualifications and requirements. These are preferred. That then sets up rewriting our job description to say this is what we're hiring for. And then use your equity lens to say, okay, is there anything in this description that folks could take wrong? Interview questions should align to the job description. So this is what we're hiring for. And then developing interview questions that relates to those specific tasks. I won't say where I was at one point in my adult employment, but during an interview question, someone asked me, and now I realize, my background is human resources management. I have a national HR certification. And somebody asked me during an interview with HR in the room, well, where are you going to go to church around here? An illegal question. So think about training our folks around, here's the interview questions. You're going to ask these of everybody, but also then putting an equity lens on those interview questions. And then review the process of eliminating disparative impact. Disparative impact from an HR point of view is defined as negative impact around the questions that we're asking. So we're checking them for my HR folks that's on the line, we're checking them for reliability. So how consistent are the answers that we're getting from all the folks we're interviewing? And then validity, do they measure what they're supposed to measure in terms of minimum job qualifications and preferred job qualifications? And again, have we gone one step further to have some kind of rating sheet where we're trying to pull out that biases around who we're interviewing and ranking them based on what we require, what we've decided is a excellent answer to that interview question, average answer, or below average, or whatever your company may be using around trying to eliminate as much biases out of the process. So if we go to the next slide, so once we understand cultural norms, we understand biases, then we start measuring how inclusive we are, So part of the audit, if we're doing an inclusion audit, is are we using general neutral verbiage or verbiage that's is for everybody? I think I shared this in the previous session. I was doing some training for one of our local plants, and because it's a manufacturing plant, they have a nurse as an employee. But in the employee's handbook, every time it referred to the nurse, they used the pronoun she. So in terms of the audit, I had to say this is an audit or an inclusion audit exception because it's gender-based category of this position. Looking at that, so we have a question, where does essential versus non-essential functions come from? So I will answer that before we move on, because that can be very important in terms of your audit. So when we look at essentials, there are a couple of things that are going on. So when you talk about preferred minimum requirements and preferred requirements, you are talking about them tied to specific tasks you have identified during your job analysis. When you get into essential and non-essential functions, you are complying or in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act is where most folks are looking at where they come from. So with the Americans with Disabilities Act, it says that as we are thinking about our jobs, and particularly our job descriptions and our treatment, that certain illness are defined as a disability, where when we're looking at our termination, our separation policy, we can separate an employee that is covered under the Americans with Disabilities Act when they no longer can perform the essential job functions of the job. Now, in the early lawsuits around Americans with Disabilities Act and terminating employees that had disclosed their disability, companies that had not defined essential job functions, that at a minimum, to do this job successfully, employees have to be able to perform this, and this, thus these essential job functions. That in every case where companies had not defined those, the courts found in the favor of the employee that was suing the company because it had not been spelled out. So then the HR folks and the legal folks got together and said, okay, to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, you know, don't just define minimum requirements to do the job and preferred requirements, but then from those pull the essential job functions that a reasonable person, and then the language changed a little bit later around the prudent person, would be able to do in this organization. When they can't do it, but they have disclosed their disability, they're no longer protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act because they can't perform the essential job functions. Now, from an ethical point of view, we encourage employers to still try to find reasonable accommodations for that employee so that, again, you're trying to mitigate the likelihood of them suing you for wrongful termination, and specifically under the Americans with Disabilities Act and or under the Vocational Rehabilitation Act. So several of your federal laws may kick in. So good question. In measuring inclusion, you also are looking at equal access. So who has access to everything within our organization? Equal opportunity to participate. So where I find that companies fall short with equal opportunity to participate is in two areas. One is where they're really intentionally trying to be more inclusive. They then they start using tokens. And so they want to make sure they have a diverse committee. So they make sure they have at least one female on the committee or the team or the work group. Or they want to make sure they have a person of a darker hue on there, or a Hispanic Latino person if they have that person in their organization. So in one area, they're, in terms of equal opportunity to participate, they really are narrowing that focus, and it points to they need to hire more inclusively. And then the second is working with vendors, where each vendor that they may be working with may not have the same access to opportunity with that organization. So let's say, for example, you're working with an organization and you're holding your vendors at different levels or different status. Or one vendor you just constantly go to just because it's easy to work with that vendor, versus doing a request for proposal where you open up that opportunity to be more inclusive with your vendors. So just around that equal opportunity to participate, looking to make sure that your policies, procedures, rules, and regulations have been clearly communicated with all of your employees. Clear grievance policies and procedures within the organization. So if you feel like, particularly if you're a non-majority employee and you feel like there's been some violation, here's the process you go through. Making sure it's anonymous, but also making sure there's no retaliation. So having a clear non-retaliation policy as part of that grievance procedure. And then clearly investigating and making sure folks know what that process is if they feel like there's some biases occurring within the organization. As we continue, the next slide. We continue to look at ways to measure inclusion. Thank you. So we started looking at displaying information about resources and making sure that's in the community where our non-majority clients are and that our employees may benefit from. So again, do we just put it on our website? I have millennial clients that I work with around the entrepreneurship development work that I do. And so, they're bad about saying, well, it's on my website, it's on my Facebook account, it's on my Instagram. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But if your clientele is not from your same age category, what are you doing to drive your non-traditional age group to your website, to your Instagram? Are they even looking at that? If we can, let's go back one slide, please. So back one previous. So where are you?
I don't know how I did that, Dr. Fox. I apologize.
Not a problem. So again, looking at where you're displaying information. Is it in the community? And you can stay there. You can stay there because we'll get to that one in just a second. Where are you displaying pictures, posters, artwork, etc. around the organization? What type of printed materials are you using? What are you doing around your majority space assessment? Or you may hear it called a dominant culture assessment. So as you're walking through your organization, you're walking through your buildings, what does it look like? What does it say to your non-majority folks? And then start looking at your organizational climate, examining your organizational climate. Again, the employment demographics. Look at the length of employment of folks in your organization, particularly if it's male dominant. How many years have that person been in that leadership role? Are they moving to other areas? What's the category of employment, etc. And then develop these common benchmarks that you see on the screen. So the ones I pulled for you all today, since we're talking about competencies in hiring, comes from a book that was published by the Society of Human Resources Management. So Managing Diversity, a complete desk reference and planning guide. And so the beginning of that book gives you some narrative around what is diversity and inclusion. It's an older book, so they don't do a real good job around equity and using the equity lens. The second part of it actually gives you some printed copies, and it comes with a disc that you can pull some of those things out. But some surveys and inventory things you can start asking your employees around how inclusive they feel the practices are within the organization. So, and then the third part gets into some how-tos. But some of the benchmarks they use is they start with looking at the overall demographics. So as you're trying to be more inclusive in your hiring practices, and we have a couple of folks online today that works for universities. So even when you're trying to look at your student populations and you're trying to be more inclusive in a diverse student population that you are drawing to your campuses, or your company, and you're trying to diversify your marketing strategies for a more diverse market of your potential customers and clients. What is the demographics? What are the demographics that you're working with within your region? What's the percentage of number of majority and non-majority outreach channels that's in your area? Are you even aware of them? So I was doing a training 2 weeks ago, and we got to a similar slide, and somebody raised their hand and said, well, we're trying to advertise more, but I'm not sure what are the radio stations that Black people listen to in the Asheville area? What's the newspaper that they reached out to? And I said, well, if you're talking about radio stations, Elder Hayes, WRES, is one that a lot of folks get their news from. So if you're not advertising there, you're probably missing a population. Urban News, Mrs. Journey Grant is a newspaper that is owned by a Black female. So a lot of people of a different color hue, darker hue, subscribe to that. If you're talking about in Hendersonville, and so I listed 2 or 3, and somebody said, I never even knew that WRES, that radio station, was even here. So again, exploring how to reach out to non-majority channels to get your message out there. And then I'm, percentage and number of majority of non-majority participants that you are working with. Do a gap analysis around performance indicators. So I did a little work with the Bobcat Arena. See if you get an audit from OCC. I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head. The threshold of number of employees, that one I would have to look up. If you're looking at doing a gap analysis, a performance appraisal, I did a little work with the Bobcat Arena in Charlotte when they were changing leadership. And they had a huge number of employees of a darker hue, and then population of employees that English was not their first language, that felt like the organizational climate was not conducive to them, as well as they felt like they were written up in terms of disciplinary policies and procedure more often than their counterparts. Part of the analysis was actually going through 3 years of their write-ups, their performance, well, 2 areas, performance appraisals and disciplinary conduct offenses. So going through the paperwork and looking for trends. Now, I did find some disturbing trends around that. And so again, when you look at your organization, start looking around some tangible benchmarks that you can use, and then visual displays, of diverse arrays of individuals, where you're looking at your marketing pieces. First of all, how many pieces of different categories of marketing pieces do you have, and how diverse are the folks that are included in those things? And then an annual review of policies through an equity lens, again, around non-biased, non-gender, non-sexist, non-racist verbiage. And then let's go to the next slide. Around common benchmarks.
I don't know. It just seems to be locking up on me. So I'll keep working out. And again, I apologize for any inconvenience, Dr. Fox.
Not a problem. And again, as I stated, you all will get a copy of this PowerPoint. Nathan has it, so he'll email it to everybody that was registered. And we're towards the end, so we're good. But also a regular review of your marketing and advertising materials. So where you're advertising, where you're using your marketing, the percentage and number of inclusion training, the percentage and number of employees attending non-mandatory inclusion training. So it's not mandatory. Are people coming to your trainings? Training that depicts inclusion through cases and examples that do not reinforce stereotyping. So I was teaching a diversity class for a Lenore Ryan MBA program, and I was it's a special topic class that they have, and trying to find case studies that were culturally sensitive was very difficult. So I actually had to just create some on my own. So being very intentional around that, and for those folks that are with us that are with education, and even looking at the textbooks that you're using, making sure they're very inclusive, the pictures are very inclusive, etc. And then training content that is culturally sensitive. So it is, if you then are able to do that, um, then look at, oh yeah, so Barbara shared that she learned recently that quotas are illegal. Yes. In fact, from an HR point of view, you do not want to even use the word quota. Where quotas came from, or the way I have been taught that, was as we moved from the Industrial Revolution into the service-based economy. Part of that was some inherited bias that we had placed in our job descriptions. So going back to job description, position descriptions around hiring women. There was the social conscious that women should not be in the workplace, that women should be home makers, and there's a whole piece I do around that and around education, and that women, if they're going to get a college degree in the U.S., should only be going to normal colleges to be trained as teachers, secretaries, and nurses. And so what happened was the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission started measuring disparative impact and the 4/5 rule. The 4/5 rule said that as you're hiring folks, 4/5 of your hiring should be representative of the non-majority folks or the population from which you're hiring from, your potential labor market. What some unethical male, predominantly male supervisors did is they did the math. 4/5 is 20%. So let's say they looked at women and they said, okay, looking at our industries, particularly manufacturing, we only have a few women that work here and they're in secretary positions. So the 4/5 rule says that the EEOC may want to look at all of our records, hiring records, to see as a baseline that we are hiring at least 20% of women from our workforce. So let's do the numbers. What is 20%? And so they actually would run the numbers. They would look at the total number of employees they had. They would look at the total number that were males. They would look at the total number that were females, and they would say, oh gosh, we need to hire 3 more females to make sure we're at that 4/5 threshold. So they actually, if they hired the next 3 females, regardless of their qualification, they got into reverse discrimination, which is also illegal. But then that mindset, that cultural mindset, came into play where predominantly male-owned business owners said the federal government has enforced a quota upon us. So the first thing, no, it was not a mandated. Secondly, it was not a quota. It said that we should look at as a baseline at least 4/5, which is only 20%. So if you argue quota, even a bad attorney is going to be able to prove then, well, that must mean that you're at work, you're hiring 80% males. So is that fair and equitable if your population is 49% females? So technically, if it was equitable and all things were fair and equal, you would have a higher percentage of women working for you. So it was not mandated by federal government. It was not labeled quota. It became a benchmark to create a baseline to say we might need to look a little deeper in their hiring practices. And so what men did was they created a artificial number that they called a quota, hired folks to keep the EEOC out of their files, because part of the issue is once the EEOC comes in, they have the authority to look at any of your records. So if companies were already doing some practices that were discriminatory, and I just use gender at that point, it could have been race, it could have been based on age, immigration, etc. They would just bump up their numbers to keep the EEOC from even coming in and beginning to question what they were doing. So that was a good question. Thank you. The next slide is potential partnerships. And again, I'm more familiar with organizations in the Asheville area, so I would suggest you look in your areas around who would be, if you're not in Asheville-Buncombe County. But in Asheville-Buncombe County, potential partners, ABIFA, Asheville-Buncombe Institute for Parity Achievement, particularly if you're hiring folks in a health area. Joanna Magici is going to know folks looking for a job. Building Bridges do a lot of work with organizations around inclusion and equity, but they know a lot of folks that are looking for jobs and some networking abilities. Eagle Market Street Development Corporation, the oldest historical African-American owned economic development institute in Asheville. Stephanie Twitty, Green Opportunities, Hood Huggers International, Riverfront Development Group, Women Business Center of Western North Carolina, YMI Culture Center. On that next slide, we get into even some more organizations to reach out to or to have job fairs at. Burton Street Association, working with the Center for Participatory Change, working with CoThink, working with the East End Street Association or the Shiloh Association or the South Side Association. I've mentioned the Urban News a couple times, or the Western North Carolina Diversity Engagement Coalition and the work that they're doing. So again, potential partners where you start making inroads into diverse population. And then the next slide is just some resources that you also can pull. Oh, and higher up staffing. Yes, thank you, Debbie, for giving a shout out for them. It's another organization that's out there. So again, and so I see, I do have some contacts. So if individual folks want to reach out directly to me, I'll be happy to share individual contact names and email addresses, etc. Then in terms of resources, most folks are familiar with this study. This study gets quoted quite a bit from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? And so this was a survey done, or a research project done by the National Bureau of Economic Department, where they took resumes and they took pretty much, they had the same experience, knowledge, skills, and abilities on them. And the only thing they changed were they made some names sound more majority or white sounding names. They took other resumes and put non-majority sounding names on them, and they sent them out. And I forget how many off the top of my head they sent out to potential employers. And what the study revealed was the more majority sounding names were on the resumes, the more those folks got called in for interviews than folks that had names that sounded like Lakeisha and Jamal. The second study I quote there for you is very similar. Minorities who whiten resume gets more job interviews. So again, how folks are shaping and putting the names on there. Now it's said in our cultural norms that names, ethnic sounding names, have an impact on our culture, but they do. My mother was very intentional in giving myself and my siblings names. I recall at one point, because my first name is Joseph, somebody asking her, oh, did you name your children biblically? Because my brother's William David, so David in the Bible, Joseph in the Bible. And she said, no, actually, I named my children based on their ability to get a job, based on the in the future, based on what their name sounded like. And so again, being very, it's unfortunate in this day and time that we're still at that level where we might have some of that unconscious bias occurring. For our folks that are on, that works in higher ed, here's a study by the Multicultural Education. This was an older study done in 2006, New Paradigms for Diversifying Faculty and Staff in Higher Education, Uncovering Cultural Biases in the Search and Hiring Practices. I left this particular resource on here, not only for the folks that are in higher ed, but some of the research that they found would be true in any organization, regardless of what type of business or industry that you're in. And then the last one is hiring decisions that affect of evaluators, hiring decisions that affect of evaluators, gender and gender stereotype. And so this study looks at how males evaluate their staff versus females, and the differences that occurs there. So just be aware of that. So we had a couple, I saw that the last chat that popped up, and I think it said, well, what about a child named Apple? But I mean, really, you have to be very intentional and think about, I tell folks, name children based on how comfortable you are, but work in the workplace to remove those biases around that. But now the problem is you may not even be aware that that bias exists if you're not the person that's screening the applications. If you're not the person that the initial applications come to, regardless if it's a hard copy or it's uploaded into your system, that person that's doing the initial screening may have some unconscious bias, and let's hope it's unconscious, that they eliminate folks from then passing those on. And then most systems, in terms of upload, as we look at Jane, you just interrupted my train of thought. I always love his comments. But as we think about our systems, with the way we're setting them up, if initially they come in online and we've set our minimum requirements, and our minimum requirements have some biases in them, then they won't get sent to the next level. So, for example, when I was hiring adjuncts, it didn't go in our regular system. So I didn't have to ask about minimum requirements. On our other systems, though, when they were full-time folks, if they didn't meet minimum requirements, then I didn't get to see those applications. So I had to be really cautious around the minimum requirements that we added. So thank you. We are at the end. We have like 1 minute. So I don't know if, let's open it. Nathan, if you don't mind opening it up where folks can ask a question or etc. We'll give a couple minutes of follow-up. Do I have a
The
check?
security settings should allow everyone to unmute themselves right now if they would like. So if you have any questions for Dr. Fox, right now would be the appropriate time. And again, Dr. Fox, thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Oh, happy to do it. Happy to do it. So there was a question in the chat around, do I have a checklist? The one I use, well, I use several, and I'm looking at my bookshelf. So again, this is my copy of that book that I referred to, Managing Diversity, a complete desk reference. I use it a lot because it does come with a CD in the back of it with all kinds of checklists in there. I do have a checklist that I use with my private consulting firm. So that one's kind of expensive when I do this just through my company. But I'm willing to, I will say this is an excellent guide if you don't have one internal to start working with. What most consultants will do is work with an organization to tailor their particular needs. But that's an excellent book to get. They're also, the city of Seattle, when they were going through some racial issues with the city and their communities, did a equity tool guide. And Barbara, if you reach out to me, I'll see if I can find my flash drive that I have that on. And if I can find it, I'll share that with you. But for those that are on the call, I think if you just Google Seattle, City of Seattle Equity Toolkit, it was designed more around local government, but there's some guidelines and some things you can pull from that guide, as I recall, as you're looking at inclusion. Do we have any other questions or comments? If not, thank you all for joining us. We are doing a third workshop in December that we'll be emailing that out to you all. I think you got that in the original email, where we will be looking at how do you align the work that colleges and educators are doing around what they are defining as educational outcomes and objectives by programs, to competency, skills, knowledge, and skills that our local employers are hiring for, so that we can have that alignment conversation. Because I will say, as a formal department chair, working with advisory committees that were made up of local companies that hire my graduates, one of the things that I noticed was we weren't talking the same language when we met. We were saying, from an academic point of view, outcomes and objectives, and they were saying competencies, skill sets. And so when we started having those, well, I think we're talking about the same things. And what projects should we have that are live projects within our courses? And what makes a student successful for you when you hire? And what type of apprenticeships can we be setting up with your company? So that third one that we'll be having in a few weeks will really focus in on some of those strategies. So have a good day, better tomorrow, and hopefully you will share this information with folks in your organizations as we really work for educational attainment that leads to gainful employment in our region.